This happened to me when I was 10 years old. Back then, my parents would often be absent for a few hours. Because of this, I would stay home alone, and the house terrified me at night. Being alone at any time meant going out to play in the yard instead of staying inside. My parents didn't like me staying in the yard because there was a lot of crime at that time, and they preferred to be cautious. So they would lock the door to prevent me from going out. On one occasion, I wasn't interested in watching TV. I preferred playing rather than being outside. But while I was alone inside the house, an overwhelmingly eerie silence filled the place. I remember that, since it was a desert area and the hottest time of day, there was no one outside. Then I heard a faint sound coming from the bathroom, as if someone was calling me. I turned to look and saw the bathroom door wide open. It was completely dark inside, and it made me feel uneasy. I didn't dare approach it because, for some reason, I was afraid of the bathroom when it was dark. Still, I kept hearing the calling from there, even though I completely ignored it. Eventually, my parents came home, and I forgot about it. The next day, I was getting ready to go to school. My mother was preparing the car because she had to sell some products for her business. I was alone in the kitchen for a moment. Then I heard that same call again. When I turned around, I saw two identical girls, about 6 years old, with short black hair, completely white skin, and dressed in old white dresses. Both were peeking out from the bathroom. Terrified, I could do nothing but stay frozen, watching those two girls waving goodbye from the darkness of that bathroom. Since then, I preferred to wet the bed until the day we finally moved. Some friends decided to visit a house that had been abandoned after a gruesome murder-suicide years ago. It was located in an abandoned, restricted area. We had to climb over a large fence to get in. Inside the fence, the area was surprisingly nice. Clean, paved streets and a bunch of homes, but not a single person in sight. We found the house, which was surrounded by a small metal fence and gate. At this point, I had no idea that this was anything other than a normal house. I didn't know the backstory or anything. I just thought it was a regular gated community. I kept thinking my friends were talking too loudly, and that we were going to wake up the neighborhood. As they were all chatting loudly, I saw someone open the door of the house we were about to enter, look out at us, and then close the door. I remember telling my friends to quiet down because we were being rude. Anyway, after that, we entered the gate and walked up to the door. The first two people couldn't get the door open, so we were about to leave. But I, and only I, heard the door unlock. I tried the handle, and to everyone's surprise, it opened, and we went inside. There was a staircase directly in front of the door, and as we started walking up the stairs, it was dark as hell. Bats began flying around us, and we had to swat them away. When we got upstairs, there was a meal set up for a family on the dining table, but the food was old, rotten, and covered in cobwebs and dust. It looked untouched. We searched all around, but didn't see anything or anyone else. I used to have a television in my room. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, it would turn on at full volume with static on the screen. I had a bunk bed at the time, and slept on the top. I remember clearly covering my ears and crying for my mom to come and turn off the TV, because I was too scared to do it. It happened a couple of times over a few months. My mom thought I was doing it for attention. She would come angrily and unplug the television. The last time it happened, my mom yelled that she wasn't coming. After a few minutes of crying, I climbed down the ladder and pulled the plug. I swear, the television didn't turn off. It took 10 to 15 seconds of me looking from the plug in my hand to the television, which was still on at full volume. It finally turned off, and I was so scared. The next day, I told my mom I didn't want to have a TV in my room anymore. I never had one in my bedroom again. I moved in with my partner a little over a year ago, and a lot of weird things have been happening in the house. I've had experiences with the paranormal my entire life. I've heard disembodied voices and footsteps, and I've physically seen the ghost of a little girl in one of the houses I grew up in. But this feels a lot different from what I'm used to. Since moving in, I've been home with just me and the kids, but I will hear my partner call my name from a back room. It sounds like his voice, but he's at work, and I know he's at work, yet it sounds just like him. It's also mimicked my sister-in-law's voice, my 4-year-old's voice, and my 6-month-old's cry, all from a back room in my house and my 4-year-old's room. Doors will also open and close on their own, and the ceiling fan in my room will move on its own, even if it's been off all day. I've also felt something sit at the foot of my bed, like it will indent, and something has touched my feet and legs. It feels like a solid human hand is literally touching me, but no one will be there. Being in the house feels heavy, and I can't really explain it. It's like the air is thick. Last year was my first year attending the University of Texas at San Antonio. Since it was my first year, I decided to live on campus and ended up being assigned to the oldest of the dorm complexes. My boyfriend was living at the newest dorm complex, and after only living there a couple of months, I found that I rather liked my boyfriend's apartment-style dorm and started living there with him full-time. One night, when he was exceptionally tired and requested the bed all to himself to stretch and relax, I decided it would be a good night to go to my room and have a girls' night with my roommate, whom I hadn't seen in a couple of weeks. It was really chilly out as I walked across the silent parking lot and past the completely dark and empty eatery. I made it to my building and walked up to the 3rd floor. Then, I swung the door open to my dorm only to find it completely dark and empty. It turned out that my roommate had decided to go to her hometown for the weekend. I had never had any problem sleeping alone there before. However, that night, I found the room immediately eerie. I had the feeling that every time I had my back against one part of the room, there was something waiting there. My boyfriend requires that I call him when I arrive at my destination after I've been walking alone, so I did just that. I called him and told him I wanted to go back to his room or have him come to mine. He refused both, saying it was too late for me to be walking around in the dark and that he didn't want to inconvenience himself just because I was a little frightened. I found that acceptable and thought I was just being silly, so I chatted with him for a while, and then he went to bed. I stayed up until about midnight or 1 a.m. watching TV. When I began to get sleepy, I got up and turned off all the lights because I can't fall asleep with the lights on. I fell asleep quickly, and I was sleeping fine until something really strange happened around 3 or 4 a.m. I was awoken by the feeling that there was something in the room with me. I wasn't jolted wide awake, as is the case in most ghost stories. I just sort of opened my eyes and lay there with really blurry vision for a few moments. My mind was hazy because I was still sleepy, and then a feeling of terror came over me. I could make out an amorphous black mist or a shade creeping over me as I lay in bed. It had to have been pure black because the room was completely dark, and I could still see this misty entity. I was horrified and drowsy at the same time. If that wasn't enough, I was paralyzed. I wanted to talk or scream, but nothing would come out. I wanted to move my arms in front of my face, but I couldn't even move them an inch. I stayed there for a moment, trying to will myself to move, but it just wasn't happening. Within a few seconds, the shade disappeared, and I could move, albeit very shakily and with much effort. I decided that even though I was shaken, it was probably just my imagination, so I slowly reached up and turned on the light. I left it at that. I woke several hours later and told my boyfriend about it. He said I was just dreaming. I told my dad about it some weeks later, and he also said I had been dreaming. But I know I wasn't dreaming. When I awoke the morning after my encounter, the light was still on, just as I had left it after being terrorized that night. I recalled everything that happened and just knew I hadn't been dreaming. Here I am, just about an entire year later, and I'm still clueless as to what happened. I did a little research and found no evidence or records that anyone has ever died in that building, although I guess it wouldn't be publicized. Some weeks before, my roommate had told me that she had seen an apparition in the room while she was sleeping alone. She said she had seen a woman hanging from a noose in the room, but I didn't believe her. I still don't believe her, because she always made up a lot of stories. Whatever I felt, I don't think it was even human. This Ouija board incident happened to me back in the 1960s. My twin sister, Rachel, and I were at the same college, living in the same dorm. Our dorm was on the second floor of a 3-story building, but the third floor had always been locked up and never used. One day there was a blizzard and classes got canceled. My friends and I were bored out of our minds, so we decided to mess around with a Ouija board. We started asking it random stuff like, who's getting married first? Typical silly stuff. And to our surprise, the spirits actually responded. Then things got weird. The Ouija board told us that the third floor of our dorm had been shut down because someone had committed suicide up there years ago. It even said the place was haunted. Right after that, we started hearing creepy thumps and bumps coming from the third floor above us. Once we all calmed down, sort of, a spirit named Sprite started talking to me through the board. It claimed to be the spirit guide for both Rachel and me. According to Sprite, twins share a spirit guide. Who knew? But then Sprite dropped a bombshell. It warned me that Rachel was going to be attacked at some celebration in another town, and that somehow it would be my fault. I had no idea what that meant. But Sprite was super insistent that I should never leave Rachel alone at any party or event. Sprite even gave me a date when this was supposed to happen, but it was like 8 or 9 years in the future, so I didn't think much about it. Fast forward to 1976. Rachel and I were at a huge bicentennial celebration in a nearby town. The place was packed with people. My friends and I wanted to hit up a bar, but Rachel wanted to go somewhere else, so we agreed to split up and meet at a certain bar later. Well, guess what? I totally lost track of time and left Rachel hanging. Some random guy saw her standing alone and offered her a ride home. Unfortunately, Rachel agreed to go with him. On the drive, he attacked her and tried to assault her, but she managed to open the car door and literally threw herself out while he was still driving to a secluded spot. While all this was going down, I suddenly realized I hadn't seen Rachel in a while, but I figured she had probably made her way back to our motel. When I got there and she wasn't around, I started getting really nervous. Then I got a call from the hospital saying Rachel had been admitted. She had a few broken bones and some cuts and bruises, but she was going to be okay. And then it hit me. Sprite's Ouija board warning from all those years ago. Rachel had been attacked at a celebration, and because I hadn't remembered to meet her, it really was my fault, just like Sprite had said. That freaked me out big time, and I swore I'd never touch a Ouija board again after that. We lived in the woods in Alabama, and there was a huge number of dirt trucks hauling dirt day and night. We would take the long walk back there to see what was going on, and noticed they had dug up a cave. Then strange things started happening. We began to notice weird symbols drawn in the dirt near our house. Our kids were afraid to play outside, saying they saw black things with green eyes. Our dogs didn't want to leave the house anymore, and we'd hear noises tumbling around under the house. One night, we checked it out, and I swear I saw something that looked like a tree person, the best way I can describe it, and it was throwing rocks at me. I heard my husband across the street in the tree line and follow his voice telling me to come. I was almost in pitch black when I suddenly heard him yelling from our house, asking what I was doing. I ran back home. There were many other strange occurrences, but eventually they began filling the cave back up with dirt and left after 3 months, having accomplished nothing. Some years ago, someone very close to my wife and me was in a serious accident. She survived, but spent a long time in the hospital and was eventually sent home to continue her recovery. Since she lived alone, we decided to move her into our spare bedroom for a few weeks until she regained her strength. About 2 weeks after she moved in, my job required me to make a business trip to Florida. These trips were common for me and usually lasted 7 to 10 days. Normally, my wife would accompany me, but this time she planned to stay home to care for our friend. However, my wife's sister, who lived nearby, insisted that my wife should go as usual, offering to stay at our house to look after our friend. A few days after we arrived in Florida, we got a frantic phone call from my wife's sister. Our friend had collapsed without warning near the bathroom, and 911 had been called. My wife and I immediately started packing to return home. But before we could finish, we got a second call. Our friend had passed away the moment she hit the floor. An autopsy later revealed a saddle pulmonary embolism, a known risk after a serious injury and long hospitalization. My wife and I drove home in a daze, arriving late at night, well into the early morning hours. Even at 2 a.m., our house was full of friends and family waiting for us, knowing how close we were to the person who had died. After some time, everyone either left or went to bed, and my wife and I decided to try and get some sleep. As I lay down, I realized I should have gone to the restroom first, so I got up and headed toward the bathroom. The moment I passed through the spot where our friend had collapsed, I was instantly transported somewhere else. There's no other way to describe it. 1 second, the dim light from the bedroom window was all around me, and the next, I was standing in complete blackness. In front of me, clearly visible despite the darkness, stood our friend. The disfiguring injuries she had sustained in the accident were gone, and she was smiling. In life, her teeth had been in poor condition, but now her smile was perfect. She didn't speak, but as I watched, a door opened behind her, flooding the space with brilliant white light. She turned toward it, and just before stepping through, she glanced back and smiled one last time. Then she disappeared into the light, and the door shut on its own. In my hometown, there's an old theater that was opened a long time ago by a wealthy business mogul who owned several businesses, restaurants, and more. One day, he mysteriously disappeared. No body, no clues, nothing. The police searched for a while, as they tend to do when rich men go missing, but they found nothing. He was eventually declared dead, and the theater was renamed, continuing its tradition of live performances and musicals throughout the year. Fast forward to 2009. I was performing a musical at the theater with a backing band and multimedia setup. During a late-night rehearsal, I went down to the basement to make a phone call. This level used to house the admin offices, but most of them are now just storage. As I was walking back to the stairs, I glanced down the hallway and saw a man with a beard, wearing a long fur coat and a hat, slowly walking toward the end of the hall with his back to me. I was surprised because he wasn't part of the band or tech crew. I called out to him, asking if he needed help, but he didn't turn around. He paused for a moment, then continued walking down the long hallway. Figuring he was probably theater staff, I headed back upstairs. When I got to the main level, I asked the others about the man downstairs, pointing out that it was supposed to be a private rehearsal. They assured me no one matching that description worked there, and the staff seemed uneasy. They sent someone down to check. As I walked back to the rehearsal through a side entrance, I noticed an old portrait near the door, of the same bearded man in a fur coat I had just seen. I did a double take, realizing the portrait was from the 1920s, and the man was the theater's original founder. To say I was unnerved would be an understatement. I ran back to tell the staff, and one woman went pale. She told me she had heard stories about his ghost haunting the theater, but no one had ever actually seen him. I worked the second shift at a nursing home years ago. There was this patient who was very sweet and childlike. She had been a resident for many years due to a surgery as a young woman that resulted in brain damage. Every night, when we put her to bed, she would say a children's prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to take. At the end of her life, she was bedridden and could no longer speak. One night, myself and another nurse went in to give her a sponge bath and change her position. When we rolled her over, her face no longer looked like hers. I can't explain it any better than to say it looked like there was another entity inside her, and it wasn't friendly. It looked angry and evil. We glanced at each other and started reciting her prayer while we continued working. Neither of us looked at her face again until we finished. By that point, her face was peaceful and she was sleeping. We quickly got out of there and compared notes. We both saw the same thing. It freaked us both out. The patient passed away a few days later. Until 10 years ago, my parents lived out in the country, about a half-mile from a cemetery where most of our relatives were buried. My father's cousin Merle died suddenly right after he turned 50. They were very close, and the death was hard on Dad. Occasionally, he would even stop at the cemetery to visit Merle. About a month after Merle passed, things started happening at my parents' house, usually when my mom was home alone. She'd find the sliding doors standing open, and lights around the house would flicker. One morning, after she made the bed, Mom saw an indentation on the covers, as if someone heavy had been sitting on the edge of the bed. One day, she called me, very distressed. The back door had popped open. She said it didn't make any sense because when she went to the door, the deadbolt was still in the out position, so you couldn't shut the door until you turned the deadbolt. She told me she was sure it was Merle coming to visit Dad. It wasn't that I didn't believe her, I truly did. But until you see something for yourself, it doesn't really seem real. So one day when I was at their house, I was using their bathroom and heard the back door, right outside the bathroom, open. I looked out, and sure enough, the door was standing wide open. When I went to shut it, the deadbolt banged against the door frame. You could not shut the door. I pushed against the bolt and it didn't move. There was no way for that bolt to come out of the housing without it being turned. I ran out to the living room to tell Mom what had happened, and she said, "Well, he always loved you. Looks like Merle wanted to say hello to you." Things continued, and one night, Mom was particularly upset. The lights had been flickering, and Dad had spent most of the day rewiring the lights on one wall. Sure, that was it. It was just an electrical problem. When it kept happening, my dad, in frustration, yelled, "Damn it, Merle, if you want to visit, that's fine, but stop screwing with the lights." Mom said they went to the living room and found the sliding door open, and nothing ever happened again until a year later. My dad had a sudden, fatal heart attack. The night after he died, I stayed at their house in the guest room. Mom said she woke up in the middle of the night and found the sliding door open again. She's sure that it was Merle coming one last time to get Dad. Nothing happened after that, and shortly after, she sold the property and moved to town. I miss my dad, but it comforts me to think that maybe Merle did come for him. The Ghost of Black Pond, Shreveport, Louisiana, 1890. The Black Pond was a small body of water with an odd inky color, which laid about 5 miles north of Shreveport, Louisiana. The pond had long held a reputation of being haunted, to such an extent that locals would refuse to pass by the pond after sunset, and some wouldn't even venture during the day, and only then, when in the company of others. Avoidance of the pond became such that the road that ran along Black Pond for 1.5 miles was abandoned for a different nearby road that didn't have a view of the pond. The stories that were told about the strange things seen on the shores of Black Pond sounded more like old legends than paranormal events. Plus, those stories were being told by an uneducated population in that area, so many who lived further out from the pond didn't take the stories too seriously. But there began recent occurrences at Black Pond that refocused the public's attention on the haunted water hole. Many began to wonder if there had been some terrible tragedy that occurred at Black Pond. William Lane, a farmer who lived about 1 mile or 2 beyond Black Pond, reported that one night, while he was returning home late in the evening, his horse chose to follow the old deserted road that ran along the side of the pond. He hadn't noticed this change in course his horse had taken, and soon found himself on the shore of Black Pond late at night. And just as he realized his horse had taken him to this place, in the moonlight, he saw the ghost of a woman leading a child along. Both of them were crying. The ghost had simply risen up from the dirt right before his horse, but before he could react and steer his horse, the animal walked right through the two figures, as if they weren't even there. By the time he got home, in a state of fright and horror, it was very late, and he had to wait hours before he could tell anyone what he had experienced. Lane was known to be a heavy drinker, so those who heard his story about the woman and the child ghosts wrote it off as a hallucination. However, the story was soon to be confirmed by a Dr. Stonebreak. The doctor had been called out to see a very sick patient. It was late, so he chose the old road because it would make better time. The doctor didn't believe in ghosts, so his journey down the old road had no effect on him. That was until his horse began to react to something. When Dr. Strongbreak looked up to see what his horse was reacting to, he saw a tall figure clad in sweeping garments with long floating hair about her shoulders. She was standing in the middle of the road. The ghost was moving quickly in a gliding motion and crying in a woman's voice. It was repeating some words, but they were too low for him to understand what they were. The ghost's back was to the doctor, and he quickened his pace to overtake her. It was then that the ghost paused and looked back over her shoulder. The horse stopped without the doctor's order and refused to move toward the ghost, rearing and plunging when the doctor ordered it to go forward. The ghost stood looking at the doctor for several moments before it disappeared into what he believed was the pond water, though he saw no splash or ripple in the pond. The doctor still didn't believe he witnessed a ghost and figured someone had been playing a prank on him. So the following night, in company of Mr. Russell Hunchford and Colonel R. Woodburn, who was 31, he went to visit the site at the same hour. All three of them carried shotguns and revolvers. They concealed themselves in some undergrowth close to where the doctor first saw the ghost. The trio waited at that spot until nearly 11 o'clock at night. The moon began to reflect on the pond back at them, and then they saw the image of a boat containing a child dressed in white. His hands were bound, his face was turned up to the sky, and he had a sunken look of a dead person. The three heard strange crying noises coming from the boat, which had a huge hole in the side. They said the noises were coming from every direction, over their heads and beneath their feet. The doctor described it as a horrible, unearthly sound, which he could in no way describe. The boat was so near to them, yet the sound was so faint as if coming from a distance. Then, the figure of a woman from the night before appeared to spring from the ground. She passed so near to them that they could almost reach out and touch her garments as she passed, but the terror they were experiencing prevented them from doing anything. As the three of them sat there, the woman was peering out over the water. As she was turning, she paused where they were hiding, and they were able to see her face in the bright moonlight. She had no eyes, and her face appeared to be someone who had been long dead. After this, she slowly dissipated, but that was followed by many voices crying, lamenting, and shrieking, as if by hundreds of voices. Then, a black man appeared. He looked as if his neck was injured, as if he had been hung to death by a rope. The three got scared at that point, and one of them stood and fired a pistol at the ghost, but the bullet made no impact. Soon after he fired, all three specters were gone, and the cries of different voices became louder and then faded. Then also they noticed a horrible smell coming from the pond. They guessed it was the smell of death. In short, people in around Black Pond began to believe that the body of water contained the bodies of several dead or murdered people.